tomorrow and add to your growth. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Amina, Mama.
Thank you, thank you. Like Fumi before me, I share an intense pleasure at being invited to comment on this massive volume. The essays in it are intense, wide-ranging, and eminently readable, and most of them are short. That doesn't mean they're not intensely, passionately written. They are vintage Paul Tiyambe Zeleza, and an absolute pleasure to read. His use of adjective strings, of alliterative adjectives, his use of popular adages, such as, people get the leaders they deserve. These things make it eminently readable, but he's never trivial, because alongside an adage like that, he also inserts the facts. People may get the leaders that they deserve, but in his piece, The Tragedy and Triumph, the tragedy and farce of Trump's America, he also notes how democracy there itself has been deeply flawed with corporate power, the electoral system, and the interference of the FBI, Russia, and corporate interference. So we're left thinking, did they deserve it? Did they not? I'll leave that for people to think. But this is just an example of how his writing is not only exacting, it's a kind of intellectual reparation, and it's not just reparative. It's also a reckoning, and there can be no reconciliation without this kind of reparation and reckoning. And the volume is a fine example. For example, turning the pathologization of Africans on its head. He describes what's gone on in Trump's America as the Obama derangement syndrome. As someone who discovered drapetomania, the disease of Africans inexorably insisting on struggling for freedom, I appreciate this turning on its head, this powerful polemical inversion of power. And this is implicit in his style of writing. So it's deeply decolonial. It's very heartfelt. He's an historian, but he writes from his own journey, as we see in this tour de force that this book is. He writes from his experience. He has lived, thought, felt the tyranny of life in the United States. And this maybe explains his craft. Zeleza has lived so long in the USA. The US is globally dominant. And yet throughout all that time, he has continuously been and stayed a friend of so many Africans' minds, to quote Toni Morrison again. I first met Paul in 1990. Paul, you'll remember, it was a conference in academic freedom in Kampala. And I recall you and the two men to whom you have paid tribute in your final chapter, Tandika Mkandawire, who hosted that conference, and Ali Mazrui, both now deceased. But they were the two men who from the floor spoke in support of the move that myself, Aisha Imam, Joe Oloko Onyango, and yourself, we were advocating that the language of the Kampala Declaration needed to be gendered. It needed not to just use the legalistic his, also, it needed to use his and hers because of the patriarchal nature of the system. And you were a sprinkling, you were the only guys, the only men at that time, back in 1990, who fully supported the early, I would say, feminist intervention back then. I never forgot it. We've remained friends since that time. So I think of you as friend, comrade, colleague, and brother. So apart from that, I want to say that probably the most, one of the things I would like to pick out is that you recap and then you take it forward throughout your essays. You recap the slave trade and that grotesque human trafficking. But as an African from the continent, you introduce the very difficult question of addressing the far less researched and far less understood impact of that slave trade on Africa, how it damaged and interrupted Africa's nascent industrial revolution. We all read Walter Rodney, our Caribbean brother at that time. early on. And what we do know is that this evil trade forcibly captured and exported many of the best, the young, able-bodied African men and women. But what I like is that as an historian, you then trace the continuity between what that did to African political regimes, how it enhanced the worst, the most venal and brutal of our own civilizations, and how it negatively transformed the continent. And in that way, it is those venal and horrible regimes that have come to prevail. So that even now, many of Africa's problems are inexorably linked to the way in which the bad parts, the worst parts, the most feudalistic and backward and violent, militarized parts of Africa's own civilizations became augmented, whereas the more democratic, egalitarian societies did not survive so well. And this is what we live with today. So you're a time traveler, not just a traveler in space and the geographies of global Africa, but a time traveler, an historian whose own subjectivity lives and activates our collective experience and our collective consciousness. And you keep your eye on the epistemological and political manifestations of that in our neocolonial higher education institutions and in the philosophical dilemmas that continue to haunt Africans at home and abroad. So for me, your writing is most compelling because you are a continental who traveled, but constantly returned to the continent. So you understand better than most the difficulties of the Diaspora project. You're writing on the power of remittances and how it now is far more than overseas development assistance, how it is more stable than the private investments that all our governments are begging for. Actually, African people are sending money home and building. And if I look around Accra now, the vast building projects that are going on are a function of those remittances. More than that, however, because a lot of people have had their eye on these money flows, you emphasize the human remittances of which you yourself have lived. We constantly try to bring our intellects and reground them and turn them to the service of the continent. The global system makes that very difficult. And above all, I think our historians on the continent are probably those who've had the hardest time pursuing the careers that this continent so urgently needs. As everybody, I hear it reiterated again and again, we cannot see our way forward if we do not reckon with our history. So we need you, we need historians, we need these kinds of living and collective histories. The time is too short to possibly do justice. But one of your favorite programs, I remember discussing it, it was on the continent, discussed long before it came, and this is the Carnegie Diaspora program, the creating of a system that would allow intellectual remittances, and the understanding that grew out of that. On the one hand, how powerful that is, but also how complicated it is, because dreams of Africa and the realities of Africa are so different, so that even the new generation diaspora, when they return, there are still lots of issues to be ironed out. Superiority complexes on one side and inferiority complexes and resentments on the other. But nonetheless, this is the way to go. And you emphasize this in your chapter 10 in particular, mobilizing the diaspora for sustainable development. And this is no longer a fantasy. I was astonished to hear that the African-American diaspora has so much wealth within it that if it was a country, it would be the 6th richest in the world, richer than Egypt, South Africa, and my own Nigeria combined. Of course, that's not happening because most of the rich are part of the global elite, whether they're diasporan or African. But it gives an indication of the wealth that is at our disposal were we to be properly organized and to be properly thinking. So this is a major contribution to the epistemological and political decolonization of the way the new generation thinks. And I think that the importance of this for the youth and for the history of the 20th century to be better understood so that we can do differently in the 21st cannot be understated. And you make it clear again and again. As Africans today, we need to ask which aspects of our societies do we want to lift up and and empower to carry ourselves forward into a more liberated future. The current situation is parlous for most Africans. It means that the 20th century we largely lost. Nkrumah lost the 20th century. Your question, or your paraphrasing of Nkrumah, let us make the 21st century ours. That is what I want to really end with. Let us make the 21st century ours. Many of us will not live much further into it, and we've already lost a great many radical revolutionary thinkers. It is up to the next generation. And I would say, I would phrase it somewhat differently. It is not only is it Africa's century, Africa, the continent of Africa, is the front line for the future of the entire planet. It has been the continent of globalization's greatest costs and discontents. Writing like this begins to show us the way forward. Africa is the front line of the world. Africa's peoples, wherever they are, need to take up that position and be inspired by reading work like this, and more than that, by activating their minds, their own experience and their histories collectively to form new ways of thinking, new ways of organizing our economies, and new ways of doing. So this book is a huge contribution, as indeed are all your other books. I think that we can just congratulate you, celebrate you, and accept you. Once again, remind ourselves that you are one of us, and we are at one with you on this massive Pan-African project. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor